So thank you, Doug. Appreciate that. In the outline, there is a link to this cohort 4 week 9 survey, your name, and a couple options for class on Wednesday. So we are certainly off for class on Thursday. But someone noted to me, they were like, most schools are closed on Wednesday, right? To give people like the opportunity to start cooking and all of that kind of stuff. So this is totally up to you guys of what you want to decide. This is democracy wins here. So if you would like class on Wednesday, pick the last one. If you want completely off, pick the first one. And if you want to do like a half class, that's also totally fine with me. So I will let you guys pick there. And then this is just a thing out of curiosity of how you type, right? Whether you type looking at the screen and you don't look at your keyboard, whether you look at your keyboard, or whether you kind of do a mix of both of them. So if you guys could fill this out for me, that would be appreciated. Should only take you 30 seconds to fill out. And you don't need me rambling on in my nasally voice about that.
Any chance you're a Friends fan?
I have seen I've seen all the seasons, but I have not rewatched it. So I don't know where that falls on the Friends fam spectrum.
It's okay. But there's this really funny one where Phoebe has a cold and she thinks she sounds better when she sings. So she's trying to like keep the cold. And every time somebody else catches it, she tries to get it back from them. Yeah, it's gross, but it's funny.
We'll give everyone a chance to vote in that, and then give everyone a chance to weigh in there, and then I will let you guys know by the end of class what the results are. Okay, and with all of that said, who wants to kick us off for stand up? What did we learn last week?
We were learning how to work with the nested arrays.
What's the point of a nested array?
To allow you
Offer more information.
Yeah.
Yep. So we're trying to group logical data together, right? So we're saying, hey, we've got schools, and those schools have teachers, and those teachers have students, right? So, and then not only using objects, but also using, or not only using arrays, but also using objects. So, I think on paper we can say, all right, arrays are pretty easy to understand. They're just lists of data. They can be any data type. And then the same goes for objects, right? We've got the key and the value pairs. But what's the next layer of that? Why do we intermix those two together? What's an example of an object, and what's the example of an array? What did we use our objects for?
descriptions of the array. Like you might have an array of like the dog breeds or the dogs, but then you need to know more than the fact that they're just dogs. So the object helps you break that down even further. Which I feel like I'm just repeating what we first said.
Nope, spot on there, right? That is definitely the basically whenever we want to store the details about what we're storing, right? Okay, The dog is an entire object because we have multiple pieces of information about the dog, right? So you can almost think about that as a variable group. And then we have an array keeping track of the list of all of the dogs. And so oftentimes that, and this is what we'll find when we're doing the movie theater seats app tonight, that we start our data out as one data structure and then go, oh crap, there's more data I need to store about that. So I need to go update that data structure in order to reflect what I want. And oftentimes data structures you don't get right on the first time, or you do get it right on the first time, but then there's additional data that we need to store about it. The other kind of interesting thing is as often in programming, there may be a better way to do it, but that doesn't mean it is the only way to do it. So as we're working tonight, you may say, well, Max, why don't we just store that in another object or in a separate variable, right? And that actually may be a better solution, right? So data structures tend to be pretty flexible in what we end up using. Anything else from last week that we wanted to touch on? Any free code camp exercises that you guys struggled with over the weekend? Any concepts that kind of sunk in over the weekend that you want to brag about or ask about?
Yes, please. There were some questions that the program kept saying it was wrong, but when I went to the hint, the people who were talking about it said that free code camp was wrong and that it should have run, but it wasn't. So now I don't know if I have it right or not.
Do you have the name of one of those exercises and we can go through it together?
Yes, assignment with a returned value.
Okay. Let me pull that up and then I will start my screen share. Okay, so as always in pre-code camp, the explanation of the concepts is up here, but then the second part is actually what they're asking you to do to pass everything, right? And so they're saying call the argument or call the function process arg with an argument of 7 and assign its return value the variable processed. So all we need to do here is we say const processed, right? That's what's going to hold our output. And then we need to call, oh, no, I'm sorry. It was already processed was already defined up here in the setup. So we can, because it is a let, we can reuse that processed variable. So what we're going to do is we're going to say processed is now equal to process arg. We're calling the function up here. And then what we're doing is we're figuring out that it says with the argument of 7. So we say 7 in here and hit run the tests and we get it to pass. So let me take a look at what they said was the correct answer in here. And it's similar to what we wrote out.
What's equal to 2?
That is what the output is. So if we come in here and do a console.log of processed, we see processed is equal to 2.
Oh.
So what's happening here is we set up our variable. We say process starts out as 0.
Okay.
From there, we go, hey, this is a function. None of this actually runs until we execute or call the function. Now we say processed, but this really gets ignored by the computer. We've got to figure out what's on the right side of the equal sign. Now it says process arg 7. 7 then gets sent up here into the num.
And I thought it was a multiplication symbol.
So what we do is we say 7 plus 3 is 10. Divide that by 5. That gives us the 2. The 2 gets returned. Where does the 2 return to? Where the process arg is getting called. That means that this whole thing is now equal to 2. 2 gets stored into processed, and then we happen to console log out the 2 right here.
Yep, if I had looked at that, if I'd seen that better. Thank you.
No problem. Xona, did you have a question?
Yeah, I sent one to Ariel and she was able to help me, but it was like I was putting in the same answer. However, it was reading incorrectly. Let me pull up the question because I sent it to her.
Yeah, if you want to share your screen on that one, sometimes it gets really finicky about like a semicolon out of line, or like you're doing actually more than it's asking you to do.
So this is the one. I sent her the answer. Sorry, give me 1 second. So this is the answer that I sent. No, yeah. So this is the answer that I sent her, but it was returning. So this is the answer that I sent her. Give me 1 second so I can just put it right in there and it'll
Yeah.
make a little bit more sense. And it was just giving me the error.
Okay, so this is welcome to the bane of a developer's existence. Do you see how these quotes are like up and down?
Oh, sorry. I was trying to move that.
Oh, you're fine.
Sorry,
Do
give
you
me
see
1
it?
second.
Yeah.
Sorry. Okay, go ahead.
So do you see how these quotes are like straight up and down here, and
Mm-hmm.
they look identical to each other?
Mm-hmm.
And then you see how these quotes are actually like slanted in to make it easier to see what the opening and closing quotes are.
Yeah.
These are called smart quotes, and the computer thinks these quotes are completely different from these quotes.
Okay.
And so this only happens when you're copying and pasting. This may not be like the exact answer that or the exact problem that you ran into. But
Mm-hmm.
basically, whenever we're typing in like English, we want smart quotes because it makes it easier to understand where the opening and closing quotes are. But in
Mm-hmm.
programming, the JavaScript is like, I don't know what that is. That's certainly not a quote, like, and gets really dumb for what is supposed to be a smart quote. So
Okay.
basically, all we need to do is flop these out here. Now I don't know if that was your problem or you had a different issue. But if we change these out, and then go down and run the test, now it's got a problem where you don't have the closing curly. So this is the closing curly for the switch.
Okay.
And now you're
So
good to
I
go.
was literally again missing a closing curly.
Yep.
Okay.
Opening one for the switch, closing one for the switch, and then
Right.
closing one for the function, opening one for the function here.
Okay, because she gave me a completely different answer than what I had here. Instead of answer, she gave me she wrote down results, and that for some reason worked. Literally it worked, and I'm like, why? But that makes sense. I understand now. I might as well add an extra closing curly bracelet.
Unfortunately, the computer will then go unexpected identifier curly brace. And you're like, oh, come on.
Yeah, I spent like literally switching everything. I spent a good 45 minutes.
There's a
I'm
good
like,
pun
oh,
there.
this is frustrating, huh?
There's a good pun. You said you spent 45 minutes switching, and this is all about
Switching,
switching.
exactly.
I will say, while switch statements you kind of have to learn because they're part of the programming language, I will never use a switch statement in my life. Like ever. I always use if statements because I personally find it so much easier to read an if else else than it is to read a switch case 1, case 2, case 3 and like spelling it out that way. I personally think it's much easier to understand like an opening curly brace here and a closing curly brace here than it is to understand the concept of like break and the fact that like this case could accidentally run into this case if you forget the break.
Yeah, it's a lot
So
of more components on it to remember.
Yeah, I personally never use the switch statement.
Mhm.
But that's not to say that, it is completely valid JavaScript that's been around since the beginning of coding. Switch statements actually predate if else statements. Switch statements are like going all the way back to like Fortran and the really old programming languages. They're more common in there.
Okay, thank you.
Yeah, no problem. Any other questions?
Can we go over conditional logic with if statements?
Sure.
Thanks.
Hey Max,
Yep.
actually, I have somewhat of a question that might tie into this. It's related to Free Code Camp. It's one of the later exercises, and my issue with it was, okay, so I did it, and there's this website called Replit. All right, I'm sure you've heard of it, Max. But it's basically it allows you to code, and it's got like a console right next to it, and it's like super lightweight. So sometimes I'll do a lot of stuff over there before I do it in Free Code Camp to make sure it works. I can like plug in different stuff, see if it'll like try and break it and stuff. But anyways, so long story short, I got all the questions answered in Replit. Like literally running it, I used the exact same record collection or the same objects and stuff that Free Code Camp used, literally copied and pasted it. Did it
Sure.
as they did it, right? But when I try to run it in Free Code Camp, it says that it's wrong. But in Replit, it says it's wrong. I mean, it's Replit, all of them are right. All the answers are right. So, and it's a lot of if else's. So if you want to look at it, maybe you could go over it and that might also help explain. Like it's a if else, if else if, else if, else if.
Yeah, let me do this one and then we'll circle back and you can share your
Okay.
screen and we can take a look.
All right.
Okay, so what they're saying here is this is all helpful to read, but sometimes I find that all of this stuff can confuse you because you're trying to emulate the example so much that you lose sight of the problem, right? So I always like to come down here and go right to this section and say, all right, now that I've read all of that, I think I understand all of that. Let me box all of that up, put it off to the side, and then try and understand just what they're asking me to do. So for this one, it says create an if statement. Okay, we know an if statement is just if, and then whatever's true goes in between the parentheses, and then whatever we want to do, if that is true, goes between these curly braces. Then it says inside the function. Okay, where's the function? The function is right here. We know we're inside of it because the opening and closing curly brace. To return, okay, what's the return do? That's the final output of this true or false. So we're going to put a return here that says return, yes, that was true, okay, if the parameter was that true. Where's that parameter? That's right here. So we're going to say if was that true is true. So we say if was that true is equal to true, then return yes, that was true. And this is one of those times that I am all about the copying and pasting because Free Code Camp will say like, oh, there's a missing space after your comma, so you're wrong. Or, you'll have a capital T in here and they'll be like, nope, that's wrong. So we know that this is a string, yes, that was true, because it's not true, false, zero, null, undefined. It's a string of words together. And then it's also going to say and return no, that was false otherwise. So with any if statement, you can do just the if statement. You can do an else if statement, or you can just do an else. And the else is going to say return. No, that was false. We run that, we get our check mark.
Okay, I think the thing I'm missing, and this is me taking it literally, is what was true. Right? I'm trying, it
The
feels like,
parameter here.
right?
So what they're doing is they're saying true or false, and we can say 7. And whatever 7 results, oh, is it not even gonna, let's do a console log so we can see the output of it. No, that was false. Because 7 is not equal to false.
Huh,
But if we put in true, we get, yes, that was true.
interesting. I get the statement. I think I just got lost on this one because I was trying to be like, what's true and what's false?
So the way free code camp works is it's running all of these cases over here. It's running all of these tests. So it's saying true or false should return a string. That means if we do our console.log true or false, and then we put in the true, we're putting in exactly what they're running here. What we output is a string. So that gets us the first check mark. Then free code camp goes on to the next test condition and says, okay, if we put in false, do we still get a string out? We do. If instead we return the number 5, all of a sudden, when we run the test, this is going to turn to X because it is not returning that out, right? So if we put that back, then it says true or false should return the string. Yes, that was true. So sometimes when I'm not passing one of these, I'll copy and paste the whole thing into a console log, see what the output is, and then sometimes knowing what that output is helpful in figuring out and debugging why that's not passing.
Okay.
Brian, do you want to share your screen and we can take a look at yours? You are muted.
Okay, I was trying to unmute. All right. So are you able to see my free code camp?
I am.
Okay. All right. So this one, it's the record collection.
He's one of my
Basically,
favorites, by the way.
it's a doozy. All right. So yeah, so I'm sure you're familiar with it. I don't know if you want to like read over it in a way that might be a little easier for everyone to read up. So basically, I'll guess I'll just go through the conditions, right? It says your function must always return an entire record collection object. So I ended my function with return records. It says if props isn't tracks and the value isn't an empty string, update or set that album's prop to value. All right. So here's what I did that might be a little like weird, and that might be wrong. Like, so one of these questions says delete the property. I'm trying to see where it is. Okay, it says if the value is an empty string, delete the given property from the album, right? And that's the only condition that like calls for what to do with if the value is an empty string, right? So I started out my if statement to check if the value is an empty string, because if that's the case, none of all this stuff matters, right? So I put delete record collection ID prop, and it should pop down to just return the records after that. Now, when I first did this all in, when I put this into free code camp, I got all of them right except for the delete one. And so that's why I was like, but it was just like that. Then I did it all in Replit and did it like this, and now I get them all wrong basically. So I'm not sure what, but when I go through it, like logically, it all makes sense. So I don't see where. All right. So we'll go over the next condition. So it says if the prop isn't tracks and value isn't an empty string, update or set that album's prop to value. I guess it can get a little tedious to go through it. So I guess I'll just show you in Replit. So basically what I did was I copied over the whole setup from there. Everything is copied and pasted. This is my function from free code camp, right? And these are all the questions and a console.log to show like what it's showing, right? To show like how the record collection updated, right? I'm getting no errors, and ultimately the one with the empty string. So that would be this one. Oh man, if I can find it in there, but it does delete it. You know what I'm saying? So like here's deleted, but I don't get why none of them are working in free code camp when literally this is copied and pasted directly. So
let me request remote.
Oh yeah, go ahead.
And I know this is this might be boring to everyone else. Well, maybe not because you guys have been in free code camp for so long. But the reason why we spend time on this in class is because debugging is 80% of all of your coding time as a professional developer, and 20% of your time is actually writing the new code. So going through here and like being able to debug, you guys see me do it all the time, but that's a skill that you get to develop with experience, right? So that's why we spend time in class over this. So I'm going to start with, let me just run the test, make sure they're up to date. Okay, so it's saying after update records record collection 5439 artist and ABBA, artist should be the string ABBA. So I'm going to say, okay, we trace through here, we get our here's the problem. We get our records, but then in our code down here, what are we updating?
Record.
Collection. Okay.
So let me just swap those out and let's see what happens.
Oh, that is well, that's embarrassing. Yeah, okay. Well, all right. Well, I apologize. I'm almost embarrassed to say how much time I spent trying to figure out. Yeah.
Say it.
So
Thanks.
that is a good flow to recognize, right? Record collection is up here, but what we do is we flow record collection through the argument here into the parameter called records, and then we update that object in here and return out the new value.
Okay.
And then from there, if we wanted to, we could say something like const updated records equals whatever, and then we could do our console.log updated records, and that would give us the updated information.
Got it. Well, thank you.
You are welcome.
Brian, I promise it's not as bad as missing a curly bracket.
Or mine.
It's all relative. Yeah, it's all relative.
All right, any other free code camp exercises or things from last week that we wanted to re-review?
So can we, I know that we briefly went over, but we didn't finish the vehicle JS that Doug showed us. Can we also take a look at that? Because in all honesty, like it took me like 5 minutes to get one question.
Sure.
And I was getting confused.
I just want to say too, Max, that thanks, because now I can't type without using Camel Case, and I've been sending messages to coworkers in Camel Case. And also every time I put a parentheses now, I immediately close it and then I start coding, and it's like second nature.
You are welcome. I will not apologize for that. I will actually show you before I pull up vehicle.js. I will show you some Slack pro tips now that you guys are. So I'm sharing my Slack screen. Close out of this. So Slack actually allows you to use something called Markdown. Somewhat maddeningly, Slack uses a slightly different format of Markdown than the rest of the industry uses, but it's almost completely consistent. So you can actually do formatting directly in your Slack messages, and a lot of writers, technical writers, will actually end up using Markdown because it's an easier way of doing rich text without having to leave your keyboard and move to the mouse. So if you wanted to, you could say this will be in, and then if you do a star and say bold and close the star and hit enter, you see like this shows up in bold. You can do italic words with underscores, and then the most helpful one is if you do something like I'm using a variable called camel case rules forever. You can do single backticks, and then and the value is 5, and it will actually put this in, it will like code highlight it. So if you were ever wondering how I paste code in like this, it's similar to the single backticks, except you use multiple backticks, and then you can say something like this, and then go down to the next line and say const var equals 5. And you close it out with your 3 backticks, and that's what makes it show up as a code block there. So those are some Slack pro tips. And pulling this all the way back to what Exona went through, if you do your triple backticks, you will notice your quotes don't slant here. That's because Slack is like, oh, you are doing code here. We won't try and do any smart code stuff. So Slack supports all kinds of markdown. And if you're saying, well, Max, that's cool, but how would I ever know that? Slack actually has its own documentation. So if you just do a search for Slack Markdown, what will come up is in their help desk, there will be a formatting messages, and they'll show you a whole breakdown of like strike throughs and code blocks and all of that stuff, and how you can format your text in order to get that rich text formatting out of it. Okay, that was a total tangent. I'm gonna go back to my vehicle.js. Let me pop this open in VS Code. And I'm just gonna do a new file. I'm in week 8, day 3, so ignore whatever else I have open. Let me just save this as vehicle.js and
I thought we
see.
used to do the capstone check-ins.
Capstone check-ins are week 12. I put it in the reminders to say that they are coming up on week 12, day 1. And while I have you on that, thank you for that reminder. Capstone check-ins are coming up week 12, day 1. That isn't until December 5th. You should have a couple pages of your capstone created, unless, of course, you only have 1 page for your capstone, and then you should have most of that coded out. So this is throwing it back all the way back to our HTML and JavaScript. You should have some A tags in there so that you can link between your pages. You should have some custom styling done to get things laying out the way that you want. And a reminder that TAs and myself are available for one-on-ones for your capstone. So if you're like, this is largely the way I want, but how do I get this one little thing done? Like, I'm really struggling with it. Feel free to schedule those one-on-ones. But that capstone check-in will be on December 5th. Okay. So print out all the vehicle types. What we need to do is we need to look at our data. This is data that I've never seen before, right? So I need to figure out what this data structure is. We've got vehicles as an array. And in this array, we have an object. That object looks like it represents a type of vehicle. Every vehicle is in an object that has a property of type. So there are 2 ways we could go about doing this. We could say, well, there are only 2 objects in this vehicle. There is the Ford and there is the Toyota. So we could say console.log, go get my vehicles, and then go get me the first object in the vehicle. If we test this with a node vehicle.js, what we'll see in our terminal is I get access to the entire Ford vehicle with my bracket 0. So from here, because it's an object, I can say I want to get out just the type. So I could say .type, rerun that, and get out just my Ford. I can then repeat that and say I also want to get out the first vehicle type, which is going to be Chevrolet, and I lied. I scrolled a little too quickly. Also get out my Toyota. Now, this is great, and there are times that we know exactly what index we want to get into, but there are other times that we want to say, I don't care how many vehicles are in, however many types are in this array, print out all of them. For that, we are going to say const vehicle of vehicles. So I'm looping over each vehicle, and if I console log out the vehicle, I'm going to get the equivalent of console logging out vehicle bracket 0, vehicle bracket 1, and vehicle index at 2. So if I run that, I get each one of my objects out. Because every time this loop runs, it is dumping each object into this variable called vehicle, I'm able to access the type from here. So I log that out, and now I get them all twice. Why am I getting them all twice? Because I still have these console logs in here. So I can comment them out and get that. Any questions on that for loop or how I went about writing that for loop?
So you want the vehicle of all the vehicles name for that.
Yeah, loop
Okay.
through the array called vehicles, give me access to each individual vehicle, and then I will be able to get out the type.
Okay.
If you wanted to, if this whole plural singular thing doesn't really make sense to you, you could call this like car details. And car details is going to represent this whole object to start, then it's going to represent this whole object down here. So we can really name this whatever we want. However, it is common to use the plural here and the singular here.
Okay.
However, this is going to give us the exact same output because basically what the for loop is doing is it says vehicles. I know what vehicles is. That's defined up here. Now, whenever I go through each individual item in that array, I'm going to dump it into this variable. Now, if we come down here and say console log car details, it's going to give me a undefined, and it's going to be like, I don't know what car details is. We only have access to those car details inside these curly braces here.
Okay.
Any questions on that one? Wouldn't it be really embarrassing if I got to one of these and I'm like, I don't know how to do that? Okay. Print out all the models in Chevrolet. Okay, so now we've got to say, all right, Chevrolet's up here. We want to get practice with our arrays and our for loops. So I'm coming up here and I'm saying Ford is the first vehicle. That means Chevrolet is the second item in this array. And inside that Chevrolet, there are an array of models. So what I'm going to do is I'm going to come down here and I'm going to say, I need a for loop. I'm going to get access to each individual model, but where is the array of the models? That array is inside my vehicles, and we said it's not the first item in the array, which is index 0. It's the second item in the array, so it's going to be vehicles 1. And then where are all of the models? They are in an array called models. So I got vehicles bracket 0 got me this whole object. I'm sorry, vehicles bracket 1 got me this whole object. Vehicles bracket 1 dot models is going to give me this whole array. So now I come down here and I say dot models, and then I'm going to just console log out my model. So I come in here, I run it, and now I get this whole giant object. So we're looping over the right stuff because the Silverado and the Tahoe are all the right Chevrolet models. But I probably want to just print out the name of the model. So because model is representing this entire object here, I am able to print out the model name, and now I only get the Chevrolet models.
Okay.
Any questions on that? Okay. So we come down here and it says print out all the class names along with the type of model. So I got to go back up. I've got to find my class, and my class is right alongside the name. So I'm able to reuse this code right here. Well, I can't really use this thing here because it's saying print out all the class names along with the type of model. It doesn't say print out all the Chevrolet names. So I need to kind of combine my for loop here with my for loop down here. So what I'm going to do is I'm going to say for const vehicle of vehicles. Now I'm also going to loop over each one of the, maybe vehicle isn't the right word. Let's say type of vehicles. Is type going to cause problems? No, we're good. So now that we've got each individual type, we can loop over each one of the models inside that type. Now, when we console log the model, we get almost the entire object outputting here, because the first thing we do is we go through this outer for loop, and it says, okay, the first type is equal to this giant object. What do you want to do for each type? Go into this giant thing, go get the models, and loop over each model. Then console log that out. Okay, I'm done with the first model. What's next? I've got to deal with the second model. Okay, I log that out. What's next? I deal with the third model. I log that out. I am out of models. I hit the end of that array. So I come back up here and say, I'm done with this entire type. So from this, I go back down to my next type and get the Chevrolet, re-enter that for loop and say, now I've got to deal with each one of the individual models. So what we do down here is we look at what the output is asking for, and it's saying output all the class names. So that is going to be model.class, and also the type of the model, which is going to be type dot type. And that gets us all the types and the classes.
Max, for the record, last week when we did this, we renamed the property type to make.
I like that a lot better. So let's change our type to our make here. And now we can use let's call this manufacturer to make it even clearer. And I've got a type not defined because where did I access type? Those are all commented out. Did I not save?
I think 138 or somewhere down there. In the
138.
outer loop or no, inner loop.
Ah, there we go. Manufacturer. There we go. Thank you. Okay, any questions on that loop? And that happens a lot, by the way, too. We look at our data and we go, oh, well, type made sense to get started, but that's not really representing what is type. Type could be the type of car. It could be the type of the manufacturer. It could be SUV, right? There are lots of different ways that we could get into type. So sometimes we go back to modify our data structure, make it a little bit more clear of understanding, you know, what data that's representing. Okay, I'm going to go through lightning round on these last two. If you guys have any questions, definitely interrupt me. So we've got to print out all of the features, I'm guessing, of every car. So we still need to go through, get every manufacturer out of the vehicles array. Once we go through each of the manufacturers, we still need to loop through each one of the models. That gives us access to each individual model. each individual model has features. So we can say for const feature of models dot features, then console log out, and I'm going to do the model dot name and colon and I'll also do the feature. Now, why don't I need to do feature dot something? That's because this is just a string. I just want to output the string. Once we get down to this array, there's no object in this array. So when I run all of that, I get models is not defined because I need to get access to the individual model here. So when we do the individual model features, we get all the output there. So sometimes it's helpful to understand, hey, vehicles is our top level. And when we go through the loop, we get access to each individual item in that array. When we're using nested objects, it trickles down to this manufacturer here. So when we're using that manufacturer, it is coming directly from here. That gives us access to the models in that independent manufacturer, which gives us access to the individual model here. For that particular model right here, we get out the features of that model. Where do those features go? That gives us access to each individual feature here, which means we can get each individual feature here. But this model.name is actually coming all the way back up from this model. So we actually have access to that nested data because we are still inside this for loop. So this is not only a nested for loop because we've got a for loop in a for loop. This is a triple nested for loop because this is inside of this, which is inside of this. Okay, now we go into the home stretch for the last one. Print out your door preference with each name. So I'm guessing it's saying so all of these have an array of 2-door or 4-door. So I'm guessing what they want us to do here is say go through all the manufacturers of the vehicles, go through all of the cars of the manufacturer dot models, and then console log out. Console dot log out the car dot name with my preferred type of car, which is a 4-door. And I guess to be even more specific there, we could say car dot doors bracket 1. So car, what's car? Car is this whole big object here. We're going into the doors array, and then we're grabbing out the first index, which is 4-door. So now we get all of these print out as 4-door. I don't know if that's what the intent of that question was, but I think it meets the requirements. Any questions on any of that? Let's call for any questions in general before we step it up a notch and get into our movie project. Okie doke. So this is what we will be building. So you guys can actually load this on your computer if you want. The URL is movies.maxmatthews. I will put the link in tonight's outline and also dump it in the chat. This is what we're building. Obviously, this is not particularly pretty, but you guys can always go back and style this if you choose to add this to your portfolio as a project. So what we're doing here is we say select a movie to see the seating options. We've got this basic drop down here. Inside this drop down, we can pick a movie and see the movie theater, right, with all of these different seats and where the screen is. So from here, you can say, okay, I would like to pick this seat, at which point it turns it blue. And we see down here, you have selected one seat for a total of $8. And you can pick a second seat, and it says you have a second seat selected for a total of $16. And if you wanted to, you could even unclick the seat. Oh, apparently you can't unclick seats. Okay, maybe we get around to fixing that. So down here, we hit the little checkout button, and it says normally we get your credit card, but for now, we'll just mark your seats as occupied, see you at the movies. So we hit OK on that, and those seats turn to red. What we also can do is go back, keep in mind that these are the seats that we marked as occupied. We can go back to a different movie, and of course, that movie has a different amount of seats that are available. But if we go back to this drop down, we can see those seats are still marked as red. Any questions on that? Should be pretty easy, right? We'll knock this down in 30 minutes or so. We'll not worry about any of that nested object stuff or any of the for loop stuff. It'll be nice and easy. 350 lines of code, knock it out, and we'll call it a night.
In 30
Just
minutes?
kidding.
Yeah, yeah.
Oh, yeah. We'll do it before break. Yeah.
Sure.
So we'll be working on this the rest of the week. There's a lot we are building here, and we are going to do this very incrementally, right? So every project is different, right? Programming is not something that we can say like every time for every project, these are the steps you need to follow. So we will be going through this as if I've never built this before, right? We're building up to this and saying, okay, what's the first thing the user needs to be able to do? The first thing the user needs to be able to do is go to the drop down and pick one of these movies. Okay, then what needs to happen? Well, we need to be able to show them these chairs. So there are two different ways of approaching this. Sometimes as a full stack developer, we say, let's go take the user approach, right? Let's go build out what the user does step by step. The other approach that we can take to this is saying, let's build out the user interface first. Let's not dive directly into the JavaScript. Let's figure out what the user interface is. Because oftentimes, sorry, I'm trying to get to the mute before the cough, and I'm only being so successful. Sometimes the front end designer will build out all of the front end interface for us, and then we as full stack developers need to layer in some of that functionality. So that's the approach that we're going to take here. We're actually going to build our entire user interface first, and then kind of take off one hat, put the other one on, and shift into, hey, we're not approaching this as front end HTML developers. We're approaching this as JavaScript developers. So how do we make this more interactive? What does our data need to look like? That's when we get into that end user perspective of what is the functionality that we need for all of that. So we are going to dive directly in here. We are going to say in VS Code, we're going to open a new folder. I'm going to go up to my code. I'm going to make my week 9. I'm going to make my day 1. I'm going to pop that open. Our project is going to need 3 files, as most JavaScript files do. Most JavaScript projects do. It would help if I called that script.js. Don't make that same mistake. Don't put an S in your scripts unless you're consistent. We're going to create our style.css. We're going to add our HTML template with an exclamation point enter. We're going to add in my title movies. I am going to put a H1 in my body that says Max's Movies 8. I am going to link up both my style sheet and my HTML. So I do my link href is equal to my style.css, and my rel is going to be a style sheet. I come down to the end of my body tag and I add in a script tag with an src going to my script, to my script.js. I go into my H1 and I'm going to do I'm actually going to do on my entire body, I'm going to do a text align center. And then in my script.js, I'm going to say console.log JS coming soon. I am going to go live and that will pop open my page. My page is going to have Max's Movies 8 centered. If it is not centered, I probably forgot my link tag or have something wrong in my link tag. And I'm also going to go back to my browser, pop open my console, and make sure I have my JS coming soon. You can ignore this failed to load 404. It's trying to load the favicon. The favicon is like the little icon that shows up. So if we go to Google, you see the little icon up in the tab bar. That's called the favicon. We don't need to worry about that for this project. So in my live share, I should have my movie title, my H1 centered. I should have my JS coming soon in my script.js. And if you would like to, you can also open my live share in Slack. I am going to start a poll while you guys are getting all of that set up. I'm going to leave my style.css over on the right side of my screen and my index.html on the left because we're going to build our user interface first. And let me start a poll to make sure you guys are all set up and ready to rock and roll. Again, final output should have my H1 centered and my JS coming soon in the console. For anyone who joined us late, there is a link that I will repost in the chat for the week 9 poll. It has a question about whether or not we are having class on Wednesday. We are off on Thursday, but if you have not voted in that poll, I just posted the link to it again so that you guys can vote. We do have 10 responses in on that and a lot more than 10 people in class. So if you guys could vote on that, that would be appreciated.
Is that poll in the live stream?
I just put it in the Zoom chat. I can also put it in the live stream for you. I don't know if I was muted on that. Snyder, I put it in the live stream.
Or
Okay, we are going to dive in here. Looks like most of you guys are all caught up. Again, we should have our movies 8 showing up centered in the page, and then we should have our JS coming soon. So I'm going to open in a new tab what I want my final output to look like, right? So I've got my Max's Movies 8, then I've got this text here that says select a movie to see more seating options. So I want to come in here, and I'm going to add a little P tag. It says select a movie in order to see seating options. I get my P tag in there. I come over here and I've got that showing up as well. So now I come in here and I've got this drop down here. What kind of drop down do I want to use here? What is this called in HTML?
Select.
Select. So I'm going to come down beneath my P tag. I'm going to grab a select tag. And I'm going to start adding up some options here. So weirdly enough, I need to leave a blank option here because that blank option is the one that's actually going to show up at the top here. So that option is what allows it when the page first loads for it to be blank. So now I'm going to go in and I'm going to add in my other options here. I'm personally going to use the movie list that I already have in my final version here. However, you are welcome to use whatever 8 movies you would like to use, or more than 8. That 8 of them doesn't actually matter. Just gives us a chance to test between them. You're welcome to load up whatever you want. So I'm going to say The Godfather. I'm going to say, let me see if I can keep this open on another monitor so I can reference that. There we go. So The Godfather, Shawshank, option, Casablanca. Going to do my Citizen Kane. I'm going to do my Gone with the Wind. Of course, you can't have a movie app without Wizard of Oz. Vertigo, good classic, and Psycho. What we all are for learning to code. Okay, so I come over here, I got my drop down, and I think I am all good to go. I click on one of them, and I'm like, ooh, I need my seats. So I go back to my final version. I look at this, and we can almost treat this like a wireframe or a mock-up, right? This is showing us not only what we need to build, but the look and feel of all of that. So I'm looking at this, and I'm like, I need that seat to show up. Now, I could go on and find that seat, but that looks like an icon to me. It's almost like we used an icon library before to get all of that working. So I'm going to go to Material Icons. And the first or second link I get should be to Material Symbols and Icons. I'm going to pop that open. And I'm going to search in the Material Icons or Symbols for a seat. And what do I get? I get my chair. So I click on my chair. I go down to this static icon font. I copy that whole link tag. I go back over to my HTML and I put that link tag in above my style.css. I want control. I want my style.css to be able to override the font icon that's coming in. Then I grab my chair icon and I come back over here and I say, I'm going to make a new div and I'll put an ID on that of my seats. And then inside of that, I want an entire row of seats. So inside of that, I'm going to do an ID and I'll say row 1 and I will put in my seat. So I save that. Again, I did a Google search for material icons. I grabbed this first link up here in here for the search. I did a search for seat and I got my chair. If you guys want to use any of these other ones, you're more than welcome to. I clicked on the chair. I ignored this variable icon font and went down to the static icon font. From there, I copied that and I paste that in to right above my link tag in my index.html. I then came down here and created a new div ID called seats. I know that looking at my final product, I'm going to need multiple rows of seats. So I just created a div called row 1. And then I went back to my Google material icons to the static icon font. I copied this, inserting the icon right here. I then went back over and I pasted that span in there. And if all of that is working, we should see my first seat show up. We'll launch a quick poll here just to make sure everyone's following along that wants to. There were a lot of little steps in there, right? So if you are lost, if you don't have your chair showing up or your drop down isn't working, that's totally okay. Just raise your hand. I would much rather screen share with you now than have you lost for the rest of class. So if anyone has any, needs me to go over any particular step, that's also totally cool. We went a little fast there, but general idea, we pulled in the font icon font so that we can use our chair. We added that into our tag up at the top. We got a select set up with our option drop down. And then we also put in our div for just the first chair. Any questions before we move forward? Any steps you want me to go back over? We got a good understanding of everything. Where are we at? Okay. So while we're in here, let's look at our final one. This is what we want to get to, right? So we're taking this approach of we want to get the entire user interface done. And once we get the interface done, that's when we can switch into our JavaScript, right? Some people don't code like that. Some people go step by step and they intermix their HTML and their JavaScript together. Really gets down to personal preference and where you feel the most comfortable. So what we're going to do is we're going to finish out this user interface here with just a little bit of CSS. So I've got one chair showing up, but when I'm in here, it looks like I need 1, 2, 3, 4, 5, 6, 7, 8 chairs showing up. And I've got 1, 2, 3, 4, 5, 6, 7, 8 rows of chairs. So I can do that pretty easily in my HTML. I'm going to take my chair and literally copy and paste it 2, 3, 4, 5, 6, 7, 8 times. So I go back over to my code and I've got my 8 seats. Okay. But my 8 seats don't have this little nice space between them to show the aisles. So of course we could go in here and we could add another class that said, hey, like this is an aisle seat. But we can also get fancy with our CSS selector. We can say, go grab the material symbols outlined. And in that outlined, get what seat? Get the nth child. Go get the third seat and add some margin to the left of it of 20 pixels. Nth child is saying First one, ignore. Second one, ignore. Third one, that's the one that I want to target in my CSS selector. So if we look at my code, now I got a nice little gap there. Well, we can also emulate that and say, I want you to not only target the third child, I want you to also target the seventh child. 1, 2, 3, 4, 5, 6, 7. So what we did there is we said, instead of adding a class to the seat directly, we said, go get the third seat and the seventh seat and add some margin onto the left of it. Now we need our 8 rows. So we come back over here. Archero, go ahead.
Why is it 7 and not 8? I'm missing something.
Because we want to say, where do we want to add margin to the left? We want there to be a gap between the 6th seat and the 7th seat.
Okay,
Right, so we're saying, okay, it's not the 2nd seat that we want to add the gap to, it's actually the 3rd seat because we're targeting the left of the seat.
gotcha.
And then same goes for over here. We're saying 1, 2, 3, 4, 5, 6. We could add margin right to the 6th seat, or we could add margin left to the 7th seat.
Okay, that makes sense because but the third seat is also the third position that we were ignoring, so that's what threw me off.
Yes. And to make it even more confusing, while CSS 0 or while JavaScript 0 indexes, CSS does not. So nth child 1 is actually the first item in the list of divs.
Okay. All right. Thank you, Max.
No problem. All right, so let's finish off our CSS before we are, I'm sorry, our HTML before we head into break. I'm actually going to take out my ID row. I don't think we're going to need it. I take this whole big div and I come in here and I go 1 row, 2 rows, 3 rows, 4 rows, 5 rows, 6 rows, 7 rows, 8 rows. Man, that seems very inefficient. If only we had a way of looping over a bunch of seats in order to generate our HTML. Foreshadowing. Okay, we'll get back to that in a second. So I'm going to save my HTML. I come back over to my browser and I've got my nice grid of all of my seats that are available. We've got 2 more things we need to finish up on. I've got my screen here, so I can come down to the bottom. I'm going to come outside this outer div. This outer div goes all the way up to my div ID seats. So it's very important that my screen is outside of the seats div. We'll see why later tonight. So I'm going to do a div ID of screen. I guess I can do a self-closing tag there. And inside there, I'm going to target my screen, and then I'm looking at that, and I go, what's the first thing that jumps out to me? There's a border around that div of 1px solid black. There is a defined width to it, right? We're saying we want that to be a little bit bigger. So let's, I don't know, pick 275 pixels. And when we save that, we come back over here, and ooh, that does not look good. Why does it look like that? That's because in my final version, I have the word screen in the div. So I probably need to add that word in. Come over here and I got my word screen showing up, but there's no space above it or below it. So I can add a little padding to this of 20 pixels on the top. And padding on the bottom of 20 pixels. I'm going to save that. And now I got my screen looking the way I want, but it's not over centered. I'm like, well, why not? I got my text align center here. That's because this text align only will center inline elements. So far, my H1 has been inline, my P tag has been inline, all of this is inline. I need some way to tell it that screen is also inline. So we can actually get away with that by changing the display property. We want to tell that to display as an inline block. And when we do that and save, we get our screen showing up where I want it to go. Okay, that was a whole lot of HTML. We just wrote 113 lines of HTML faster than we've ever written HTML before. But don't overwhelm yourself here. Keep in mind that this is all mostly copied and pasted. Once we got our first select working, we created our div ID seats. We created a div for each row of seats, and then we put in our span tags here. So our final result should have our dropdown, should have 8 rows of seats. 3, 4, 5, 6, 7, 8. Oh, turns out your instructor can count. Should have the green div down at the bottom. Should have our basic styling around that. Styling should not be anything surprising to anyone. We just use this display inline block in order to take advantage of this text align center up at the top.
Kind of a quick question. By adding the display property, is that like a flex property or is that just a normal CSS
It's
thing?
similar. It's similar to flex, right? Because we've used display flex before. It is an alternative to flex. So there are like 8 display properties that you can use. One of them is like fixed. So that you can say like, no matter where the user is scrolled on the page, I always want this to show up at the top of the page. So display has a bunch of different values. If you do CSS display, W3 schools will come up and they'll show you the different values that it supports. Inline block, flex, grid is now becoming more popular. Inline block is what we just used. And then I don't know that I've ever used any of the table properties before. So certainly the most popular ones are inline block, flex, grid, and inline block.
Good question though. Aren't inline and block like kind of like completely opposite, or am I interpreting that wrong?
Yeah, so it's a combo. It displays the element as a block container, but uses the positioning of the inline.
Okay, that explained it better. Okay, that makes sense at that point.
So the element itself is formatted as an inline element, but you can apply height and width values to it. So it's basically treated as inline, except for the height and width, which it uses the block positioning for. It's a very dirty way to center things because CSS centering things is way harder than it needs to be. And so inline block is commonly used to get things centered when you want to kind of treat it as text, but still have the ability to set up, height, width, and all that kind of stuff.
Got it.
Okay, that was a ton of code. How are we feeling?
Mine doesn't look like yours, so I don't know what I did wrong. I did write everything. I'm
Share
probably
screen, take a look.
probably missing.
You're
something.
missing a closing curly. We haven't used any closing
I
curlies, but you're
promise.
missing a closing curly.
More than likely.
Okay, so your row of seats should be inside this div in here.
Okay.
So if we take that closing div and move it down, oh, it looks like you have the. Okay, so 2 things. One, we've got a div ID. Oh, hold on. You've got your div ID seats. You've got your opening div and your closing div
I just have a closing div.
for
So
the row. So I think these are just extra.
that's probably.
And that happens when you copy and paste, it's easy to grab a little bit too much. And then this is your closing div for the last row. This is
Mhm.
your closing div for the seats section. And now go ahead and switch to your browser, see if that got you what you wanted. So you're on your way. The only thing you're missing is the gap between the rows. Or I'm sorry, between the and I think that's because you have outlines instead of outlined.
Okay.
That do it?
Oop, undo. Okay. Save.
Good to go.
Thank you.
Other questions?
Could you go over the knife child thing? Because you have 3 and 7, and I just want to understand what's happening
Yep.
there.
Okay, so what we're saying is we're adding spacing to the left of whatever we target up here. So we're saying we want to add margin to the left of the 3rd seat and the 7th seat in the row. So what that means is we say this is nth child 1 and nth child 2. We don't really care about those children. The firstborn always gets ignored. No, I'm just kidding. We're say first child and second child ignore. The 3rd child, add some space to the left of that seat. So that margin left only applies to the 1, 2, 3, the 3rd nth child. Then we go 4, 5, 6, we ignore. And then seat number 7, we want to add space to the left of it as well. And then we don't target the 8th one either.
Thank you. Thank you.
Any other questions?
Yeah, can you just briefly touch on the display and inline block?
Yeah. So when we display inline, it gets treated as text, right? So we can position our text with something like text align. However, screen by default, because it's a div, it's not treated as text. It's treated as a block element. Block elements by default take up the full width of the screen. So the
Okay.
problem is inline elements can't have height and width properties because the height and width are calculated by how much text is in that line.
Mm,
And we can't center with a text align when it's a block element because that block is just a default width. So the inline block gives us the best of both worlds. It says that we are allowed to use width, which we would use on any block element, but then it means the positioning of this block will be treated as if it were an inline element. Because it's inline, that makes our text center align apply to it.
gotcha.
So inline means the positioning of that div is going to follow all of the inline text positioning, but
Mhm.
then the sizing of that div is going to follow whatever width or height we set on that block.
Okay.
Just a dirty way of being able to make this text align center apply to even the screen div down here, while still getting our positioning the way we want it.
Understand. Thank you.
No problem. Other questions? The good news is we are pretty much done with our HTML. The bad news is after break, we start writing our JavaScript and start working with our HTML directly inside of our JavaScript. So that is where we are headed. Let's take a break now. Be back at 7:30. Last call to vote in the week 9 poll. The week 9 poll is going to determine whether or not we have class on Wednesday or not. If you've already voted, you're good to go. If you have not voted, it is in the Slack live stream channel and in the week 9 outline for tonight. When we come back from break, I will announce the results of that. with most things around here, we run on democracy. So vote in that poll if you haven't already. There are more people in class tonight than have voted. So please fill that out. It will take you 30 seconds. Otherwise, I will see you guys at 7:30.
Thank you.
All right, so should be good to dive in right where we left off. Does anyone have any questions that popped up over the break? I will reveal the results of the poll with an overwhelming 71%. We will be taking Wednesday off. So we will have Wednesday and Thursday off this week. I will update the schedule after class. So that means tomorrow will be our last night of class this week. With that said, as always, have your questions flowing. If you need any help, you're always welcome to reach out for one-on-ones with me or any of the other TAs. Or just shoot me a Slack message. I think you'll find that we're pretty responsive on Slack of getting to stuff. Okay, so we finished up with everything working on our interface, right? Everything is done here. Now we get into the JavaScript part of things. We have to say, hey, when we are in this dropdown and we change a value, we want these seats to update with whatever seats are stored in for this movie. So I'm going to come back over here. I'm going to close out my style.css because I'm mostly done on that. And I'm going to go back to my files. I'm going to pop open my script.js, and I'm going to move that to the left half of the screen and get my files out of the way. I can remove my console log, JavaScript coming soon. Don't need that. And now I can say, okay, the first thing that happens when the user changes this select, I want the seats to update. So what do I do in order to listen to this changing?
Add an event listener.
Yep. So I'm going to say document, get element by ID. I need an ID on this, so I'll call this my movie selector. Be careful on your case here. Make sure you've got your capital S. I'm going to get the element by that, and I'm going to say that my onChange is going to equal a function called event that is going to console.log the event.target.value. So breaking this down at the JavaScript level, document means I'm going into the DOM, the document object model. Get element by ID is a function built into the DOM that lets me get out this selector. Movie selector should be in quotes because that is the string that lines up with this ID. I am getting the onChange function or property that comes from the document object model, and I'm setting all of that equal to, right, a new function. Now, what you guys have seen in Free Code Camp is a function that looks like this. That is the same exact thing as saying this. These two are almost identical. There are slight differences under the hood of how JavaScript executes that code, but this is the newer preferred way of defining a function because it does not define the function globally. It gives us more control over the scope. And arrow syntax with a equal and then the greater than sign is preferred. So that's why in all of my code, you'll see me using this arrow function. That's just the newer way of doing it, and Free Code Camp will update it to it eventually. But just keep in mind, this code and this code are exactly the same. So what I'm doing here is I'm saying my onChange, I'm getting access to the event as a parameter. I'm using that parameter to get the target, that is what the event happened on, and then get the value out from that target and console log it. So I go back over to my browser and I change to a movie, and what do I get in my JavaScript? I get Gone with the Wind. I get whatever I selected. And go in here, I pick another movie, and I get that movie console logging out as well. Good there. Any questions on that? Okay. So next steps, we've got access to this. What was our objective? What were we saying needs to happen when we change one of these movies?
To update the total.
Yeah, it's going to update these seats, right? So let's go to the final version. When I change to a different movie, we have a different amount of seats. But we've got to do a lot of work within these seats here, right? We've got to keep track of the seat positioning. We've got to keep track of whether the seat is occupied or not. And we also need to keep track of what seats are selected for the user to check out of. So as we normally do in data structures, we start at the top, at the biggest source of the data, and work our way down. So where do we start? We're going to have our const seats. What kind of object, what kind of data structure is our seats going to be?
Object.
It's going to be an object. And what's going to be the key?
Occupied or not. Or the like the letter like A1 or A2 position.
So we got to be careful there because that would be an array, right? We're going to have multiple seats. We look at this and we think, oh, the seats is the highest data value. But what are the seats actually related to?
Rows.
They're related to what movie we have selected. Because this is not just the seats that are available in this particular theater, they're the seats that are available for this particular movie. So what we need to do in storing all of our seats is not just generate out the array of all of the seats. We also need to store what movie those seats are related to. Because every one of these movies has a different array of seats that are available. So what we're going to do is we're going to say the seats is actually going to be an object, and the object is going to be each movie title. So I'm going to start with my first movie, which is The Godfather. The Godfather is going to be an object. That object is going to have different information available with it. One of which, if you look, we've got parentheses 8, we've got the price of the movie. So we're going to store in that object the price as 8. The movie also has the seats that are available in it. So maybe instead of calling this seats, which seemed like a good object title to get started, this isn't really just containing the seats, it's also containing all of the movies. So instead, why don't we call this movie data instead? Okay, now we've got the movie name in there and we've got our seats, but our seats we know need to contain objects. Why do they need to contain an object? Because we need to know whether it's occupied or not, or we need to know if it's selected or not. So what we're going to do is we're going to make seats an array. And we say, okay, the first row of seats is going to have whether it's occupied, true, or occupied, false. And we're just going to get our first row working. We got a lot of other seats that we've got to go through. So we say, okay, we go occupied, false, occupied, false, occupied, true, occupied, true, and 1, 2, 3, 4, 5, 6, and then we'll say 7 and 8. So we've got our array of seats. That's just the first row, but that's a good starting place for us, right? We've got our data kind of structured right. So what we want to do is we want to take this data, come back over to our code, and when we click the Godfather, we want to see that first row of seats. So I come in here, I click on the Godfather, and what do I need to do? We've got our data structure starting to form here. We've got our on change linked. What do I do next?
Do you have to link the HTML to it?
We've got to link the HTML to it. So
So
we're going to
inner?
get, yep, we're going to
Yeah.
get the HTML. We're going to say document get element by ID. And we're going to say get the seats ID and set the inner HTML equal to what?
Movie
Seats
data?
Or that, okay. Question, are you on two different Max movies thing? Because I seen the price on one thing, but like the other one doesn't have your prices.
Yeah, this is the final version that we're
Oh,
building our way
okay.
up to. Just so we've got an idea of what functionality we want. And then this is the one that I'm actively like editing and coding out as we go.
Okay, that had me confused. Thanks.
Okay, so we come in here and I pick the Godfather and I get object. Okay, well, we said inner HTML, but then we took this movie data, which is this whole object, and we said, hey, JavaScript, go shove some JavaScript object into our HTML. And HTML got an object and was like, I don't know what this is. That is an HTML. So it displayed object. What do we need to do in here to figure out what we want our inner HTML to be?
I would think maybe get the name from the movie data object.
Yep. So we're going to start by saying const selected movies seats. Selected movie seats. And where do we get that from? We get that from our movie data. And then we go, okay, inside our movie data, which movie do we want to select? Well, we want to select whatever the event target value is. We want to select whatever they took from that dropdown. So that we know the event target value is the Godfather, and the Godfather happens to line up with the name of the movie in the movie data. So we are going to get the event.target.value. Now we've got this whole object, and we want to go one layer deeper. We want to get out the seats for this. So we're going to say .seats, and then we are going to console.log our selected movie seats. So I come over here, I go Godfather, and now, well, that's convenient. I've got an array of all of my seats here, whether they're occupied, true, or false. So I come over here and I say, hey, we've got this figured out. The inner HTML is going to be the selected movie seats. So I come over here, I select my movie, and now I get object. Well, we got 8 objects. We're on the right track. Before we only had 1. We know that these objects are representing a seat. What do we know about arrays?
We can loop over them.
We can loop over them. So what we're going to do is we're going to go through and we're going to say, get each seat of the selected movie seats. And in there, we need to generate the HTML that is going to make each seat show up. So what we do is we say, okay, let's make the generated HTML equal to an empty string. And when we have that empty string, every time we get a new seat, we're going to take our generated HTML and we are going to add, we're going to plus equal. That means add to the end of it. What are we going to add to it? We are going to add all of this HTML that we already have generated. Oh, I'm going to use single quotes there. So, whoa, where did I get this from? I came over here and we already have our chairs showing up. But what I'm trying to do is get the computer to generate the HTML based off of the data in the array. So if I take this generated HTML, I'm going to copy it and paste that into what I want to get set. I save that, I come back over to Chrome, I go into The Godfather, and now I get my seat showing up. Okay, that was a lot of code. Let's take a step back. We got our data set up here. We know that we need different seat data for each movie. So each movie is going to be an object that has a key, and then it's got all the data related to the movie as the value. From there, we said, hey, there's a couple pieces of information that we need to store about the movie. We need to store the price of the movie. We also need to store the seats. But because there are multiple seats, we need another array to keep track of the seats. Now, to get started, what information do we need to know about the seat? Whether it is occupied, true, or false. Down the road, we may modify that and have other data about it as well. So to get started, we're going to say it's true or it's false. Now we come down here and we say, go get the movie selector. Movie selector is coming in from our select here. We're saying when that movie selector is changed, console log out the event target value. That value is going to be The Godfather or Shawshank or Casablanca or whatever it is. So we're like, okay, we've got the value. Now what are we trying to do? We're trying to make our seats in the browser reflect whatever seats are selected in our data up here. So we go up to the movie data. We use our bracket notation here, our square brackets, to make sure that we get out the right movie. So event target value we know is The Godfather because that's what got selected. So we take movie data, we take The Godfather, that gets us into this object and outputs this whole massive object. Right now, we don't care about the price. All we care about is the seats. So we get our seats and we store that in selected movie seats. Now that variable contains the array of the seats that we care about. So we go a level deeper. We console log that and make sure, hey, in our console, we can see all of the seats for The Godfather. Pausing there. Do we have any questions up until this point? We understand the nesting. We understand we're going through an object. We're using a dynamic key to get The Godfather. Then we're using the seats to get this array right here. Brandon, go ahead.
The console log or the console on Google Chrome is telling me that movie selector is not defined. I have like a couple errors, so I'm not able to check it correctly.
So movie selector, make sure that your casing here matches the ID on your select here.
I didn't have the ID there. Okay.
Come back if you got another error after that one. Okay. So we're going to roll forward on the explanation here. Now we run into this problem of we've got all of these seats, but these are objects. We need some way to convert this object into something that the HTML can understand. But first, we've got an array. And we know computers are not good at handling arrays unless we ask them to loop over them. So what we do is we get the selected movie seats. That's coming from this array right here, which is flowing through our movie data.seats. We take that and we say, go through and get each individual seat out. Now, what do we want to show up for each individual seat? We want this span tag to show up. And every time we get a new seat, take another span tag and add it onto generated HTML. Generated HTML is going to start out as empty. So that means if we do a console log here of our generated HTML, we can go to the browser, and when we select The Godfather, we see a bunch of span tags that get generated. In fact, there are 8 of them. And
Max,
if we
I have a. I'm
Yeah.
sorry. I have a quick question regarding, and I don't know if maybe you explained it and I missed it. Now, the positioning of the seats, we had to like tell it to make a space on the nth child, right? Like, and it seems like the computer is doing that even with this span. So how does it know to put
because
in
it's
that?
still the first span, the second span, and then the third span. So this third
Got
span
it.
is still
Okay.
getting the CSS applied to it.
Got it. That explains it.
Yeah, so if we achieve that by putting a class in here that said like aisle seat, then we would also have to replicate that in our JavaScript over here. But because we target it just based off of what number seat it is in that div, we don't have to worry about that. Okay. So we've got our chair showing up. We've got 8 of them showing up. We generated out all of that HTML with all of those span tags. We then got our element by ID seats. That's going back here, grabbing this div ID seats. And what is it doing? It's taking that generated HTML, all 8 of those span tags that we generated, and putting them into the seats. That means when we come over here and change our movie to The Godfather, we see the 8 seats. If you only get one thing tonight, I want you to make sure that you understand every line of this code. So much so that we are going to spend 2 minutes. I would like you guys, if you don't have this working, to copy and paste this and go through and add your comments to this code. Because spoiler alert, that's going to be your homework for this weekend. But I want you guys to go through this and just add your own notes. Make sure you fully understand this. And if you get to a point that you don't understand, let me know and I can go through it.
Could I share my screen? Mine is not working.
Go for it.
Okay.
Okay, so nothing jumps out to me. What error do we get in the browser? Okay, so one thing that I notice is you have selected No Country for Old Men. But if you look over in your data, we only have Transformers. So we'll end up building out this movie data down the road. But right now, when you use Transformers, you get your seats as you expect. You're muted if you're talking to us, Schneider.
Oh, okay. So if we're gonna have the same thing, for the rest of them, are we just gonna have to loop them over as well?
We'll get there. But yes. Brendan, go ahead.
Yeah, so that was kind of like the issue that I was having, but even when I do have the Godfather selected, it's still just showing like the entire
Share your screen. Let's take a look. Okay, so go ahead and refresh to clear everything out. And then go to, okay, so right off the bat, we have a uncaught type error, cannot set properties null setting on Charge.
Oh, check your event listener, Brandon.
Yeah, so line 18, you see where it says script.js:18. That's given us the exact spot that the problem is. Should be an on change instead of a charge. Okay, and so we still now we got an on change, but it's still the same error. So let switch your screen share over to your code. Brandon, you there? Or did you freeze? Oh, okay. Change your screen share over to VS Code so we can see that. And while you're there, also unmute.
Okay, sorry, I don't know why it's not showing me the right screen. Resume share. So then bring this up. There we go.
You've got to stop it and restart it because it's locked into just the Chrome window right now.
That's obnoxious. All right.
Sure is.
You share. It's this one. All better? Oh, now you're muted.
I sure am. Okay. It's looking at movie selector and it's like, great, let me go find the variable called movie selector. And movie selector isn't defined anywhere. That's because movie selector is supposed to be a string.
Oh.
Okay. Now give it a try.
I have like everything in the way. All right. What the heck?
And make sure you save before you go test.
All right. There we go. So, Godfather. All right.
Did you get your 8 seats?
Yeah.
Okay.
Okay. Yeah. There you go. All right. Thank you.
No problem. Okay. We're good to keep going here. We feel like we're understanding this code. Feeling like, all right, this is a little bit more, right? We're layering in our document, our DOM that we've seen before. We've got an event going on. We're pulling out details from the document object model. We're not only using an object here, but we're using an array inside that object. Then we're setting up this generated HTML. This is our JavaScript placeholder that's going to hold our HTML that shows up. Okay, now we come in here and we say loop over the array of all of the seats. Once we're looping over the array of seats, what do we want to do for each seat? We want to add this span in for each one of the seats and add that to our HTML that gets generated. Okay, then we log out our generated HTML and we can see that it's a giant array. I'm sorry, it's a giant list of all of the different spans. And we come over here and we take that generated HTML and we shove it into our get element by ID seats. Now, if we come over here and we pick a different movie, we get an error. Well, that's because we don't have Casablanca defined in our movie data yet. We'll work our way up to that. So I come over here. I go to The Godfather. I see my seats. What's the one thing? What are the two things that are obvious here that are missing?
The other seats and the selected. Like if you were to select a seat.
Okay, three things that are obviously missing. The other seats, okay, we'll put that on the back burner. Whether or not the seat is selected or not, and whether or not the seat is occupied or not, right? Because occupied means someone else already took it. But selected means, hey, this is the seat that you're going to buy. So let's solve the first thing. We've got all of this data in here, but none of that impacts what shows up here. If the seat is occupied, it should show up as red. So what we're going to do is we're going to add in here, we're going to say, if the seat, well, where's seat coming from? It's coming from our for loop. It's saying, hey, this whole object is going to get dropped in the seat every time this loop runs. So we're going to say, if the seat is occupied, then take this generated HTML and add in a class called occupied. Else, put in the seat, put in the chair as normal. So I save that. I go to my browser. I take a look in here. And I go to The Godfather. And nothing looks like it changed in here. But if we pop open our Elements tab, we can actually see there is a span with occupied on it. And in fact, we've got that in 3 different places. Well, wait a second. If that's a class, we can just target that class. We can go right to our CSS and add a class called occupied that has a color of red. Go back to our browser, and now my occupied seats are showing up in red. Pausing there, making sure you guys are following along, making sure you're understanding, all of that good stuff. Launching that poll, giving you guys a minute. Again, what we did is we used an if statement here. We said if the seat is occupied, that seat is coming from the array right here. If the seat is occupied, then the HTML we want to add is the seat with a class of occupied. That occupied ends up getting put into our seats array over here. That seats array is then going to use that class we added occupied color red here. And now when we go to our browser, our seats that are occupied show up in red. Bobby, go ahead.
For some reason when I go to when I'm live, it like all the seats are spaced out. I think I know why, but I think it's because of how my indentation is. But I just
Share your screen, let's take a look.
So
Yeah, something's off there. Let's look at your JavaScript. Okay, so you haven't done the, oh, you have, hit the little arrow on 17 so I can see all your on-change code. You are missing a closing arrow at the end of line 23. You have your closing span tag, but you don't have your closing arrow in there.
up here.
Yeah, inside the string. Now you see how you have your span tag? Yeah, well, get that inside the quote. So closing arrow, oh, no, just the arrow. The greater than sign.
Sorry.
And then a closing quote, and now you're good. There you go.
Thank you.
No problem.
So mine is doing the same thing. Sorry, but mine
Share your
is,
screen.
I have my quotes. And then,
You've got two, because we moved this inside the if statement, you can get rid of all of line 30.
so just remove this.
Yep. And then what's your HTML look like? What's it look like in the browser? Sorry.
Oh, it's okay.
You're good. You're caught up.
Thank you.
No problem. All right. Do we have any other questions? Yeah, Jennifer, go ahead.
Thank you. I didn't see any errors until I went into the inspect tool. And I cannot set properties of null setting on change.
Okay. That normally is because your ID on your select doesn't line up with the ID in your JavaScript. So we have a document get element by ID movie selector dot on change. Make
Right.
sure that that ID is added to the select tag in our HTML and the casing is right.
Okay, I'll check that.
And if that doesn't work, come back and you can share your screen. Okay, so we know we're nearing the end of class here, but we've got some obvious issues here. We've got our first row of seats showing up, but then the problem is that we only have one row of seats showing up. So we can fix that, but the problem is we want to keep this row of seats all grouped together and say the next row of seats should start another row, another div. So we can't just copy and paste this, and we don't want to do some weird math to say, oh, well, if it's divisible by 8, then move it on to the next line. We really should update our data structure. What do we do to get an array of arrays? It's a multi-dimensional array. We almost want to say all of these seats are part of the first array, and all of these seats are part of the next array. Whoa, we've seen objects in arrays. We've seen arrays and objects. We are now seeing an array inside of an array. That means if we wanted to get the third seat in the second row, we could actually say, go get the movie data, go to the Godfather, go get the seats inside the Godfather, and now seats is this giant mega array. So if we want to get seats in the first index, the second row, we would actually say bracket 2. Now we are, I'm sorry, bracket 1. Now we're targeting this big array here. So if I want to get the 0, 1, 2, 3, 4 index, I can say bracket 4. And now that's a mega object. So I can just say dot occupied. So if everything is working right there, I should see true in my console. I go to my console, I come over here, I change to the Godfather, and I see true. That is because we buried through this big object. We use the key, the Godfather. Then we use seats to get into the seats. Then we used bracket 1 to get into the first index. Then this big thing is still an array. So we had to use bracket 4 to get down to the 4th index, the 5th item in it. And then we could get access to our occupied. That's just an example. No one really cares about, the second row of seats and the 4th one that got clicked on, but just an example of how we can bury in to that data there. We have any questions about that? Okay, so sometimes in order to get a new feature to work, we've got to break another feature. I come back over here and I refresh and I go to the Godfather and I have 2 seats. Like, but come on, man, I just had my 8 seats showing up. Why are we only getting 2 of them? Well, what we started to do is we started to loop over the original array. That's not what we want. We need to not only loop over each row here, we then need to loop over each individual seat. So we're going to do a nested array here. We're going to say for const row of the selected movie seats. And inside of that for loop, we are then going to add in for every row, get the seat out of the row. So I save that. I come over here. I get the Godfather. Well, there are my 16 seats, because what we're doing in this outer for loop is getting each one of these arrays. Then in the inner for loop right here, we're going through that row and getting each individual seat out. Okay, but what's going on? If I look at my index.html, what do I have between each one of the rows of seats? I've got this div over here. That div did not make it to my generated code over here. So I want to say, I want there to be a new div every time there is a new row, but not every time there is a new seat. But I also want there to be a closing div every time we have generated all of the row, all of the seats for that row. So we're saying, okay, every time there's a new row, this code is going to run. So what we do is we take our generated HTML and we add a div. Then we generate out all of the seats based off of the columns. And when we are done generating all of the seats, but before we are done doing something for each row, add on a closing div. So I save that. I go back to my browser. I go to the Godfather, and now I've got my 2 rows of seats. And if all of that is working right, I can actually change some of this and say, hey, it turns out the last 4 seats are all occupied. That allows me to go in here, go to the Godfather, and see my last 4 seats are showing up as occupied. Okay, mega amount of code there. Let's just focus on what's new, and then we'll call it a night. No more code, just reviewing here. So we had our generated HTML before. We were saying, hey, go get the seats. But before, we only had this for loop, right? This for loop was running over for each one of the seats in the array. But we know that our seats are not only just across, they're also down. We've got rows of seats also available. So we went back up and we modified our data structure. We said this is actually going to be an array that holds a bunch of other arrays. So this index, this first array in the seats array, is going to represent all 8 seats in the first row. This second array is going to represent all 8 seats across in the second row. Okay, so from there we go, all right, our data structure makes sense, right? So we're saying this is in the second array, that must be the second row. And we're saying, okay, occupied for the last 4 seats in that row. So when we go look, we see the last 4 seats are occupied. Now we come down and we go, well, our HTML has to be generated differently. Our HTML needs to go through each one of the rows. And while it's going through each one of the rows, it also needs to go through each seat in that row. So from there, we say, okay, every time we make a new row, add in a div. That div is the same div we see here. Now, go through each seat in the row and see if the seat is occupied. If the seat is occupied, throw this span tag in there with the occupied class. Otherwise, add in a regular chair. Where is seat.occupied coming from? That is flowing all the way through our loop. We start at the selected movie seats, we get each row. Once we get each row, we go through each seat in the row and get that seat. What does each seat have on it? It's got information about where it's occupied. Where's that occupied information coming from? It's coming all the way up from our data up at the top. That true is coming all the way down to this if statement here. That if statement is saying if the seat is occupied, then generate out the span tag with the word occupied in it. If it's not occupied, just add another regular span tag in there. Okay, now we come down and we hit the end of this for loop for each one of the seats. We say we have generated out all 8 span tags for this row. So before we get finished with the row, we've got this hanging opening div tag up here. So we also need to put the closing div tag in. Now it hits this curly brace, goes all the way back up to the for loop here, and says, is there another row of seats? If there is another row of seats, we need to add in a new div tag for it and generate out all 8 span tags based off of whether or not the seat is occupied. Now it gets down here and goes, that's it. We have hit the end of this array right here. We are done. There are no more seats to generate. So we come outside of the for loop and we say, log out all of the generated HTML so that we can take a look at it and take that generated HTML and set it into our seats. Isn't this going to be fun commenting for homework this weekend? Is there stuff from Thanksgiving dinner? You can go back and look at this code and just sob into your mulled wine or whatever beverage you're you're drinking.
Just and one thing I kind of want to point out, because it was a little tricky for me at first, is like when in the if statements, because like C dot occupied, like normally I think most people would think of like if C dot occupied equals something, right? But because it's like a binary, like you could just say if it exists, right? Like, or maybe could you expound on that? Because I think that's kind of a hard concept to understand, like the way you did it, you know?
Yeah, thanks for calling me out on that. That's a really good point. So, an if statement, whenever you're checking for truthiness, you don't need to put this equal true. So basically what's saying is because seat dot occupied is equal to true, you're basically just saying if the seat is occupied, but the computer is implicitly adding this equal true automatically for you. So normally we have two sides of a logical comparison, right? We say if this is equal to this, then the whole thing is true. Or if this is not equal to this, then the whole thing is whatever. So what I did here was a little shorthand. If you don't put in the triple equals true, it just assumes that whatever value you're looking at is comparing it to true. So what we're saying is if the seat occupied is equal to true, well, we know it's equal to true, so go ahead and add in the span tag with the class. Otherwise, if occupied is false, seat dot occupied is not equal to true, so we're going to do this else case down here. It's almost like all of those hours that you've invested in those free code camp exercises are paying off to actually make a full app. Almost. Okay, we're stopping here. Give me some feedback. How are we feeling? Feel like we're understanding it. Maybe we wouldn't be able to write it from scratch, but we're feeling like we can look at this code and go, yeah, I can tell you what that line's doing. I can tell you where we're working in the data. I can tell you how that nested for loop is working. I can tell you how that conditional works. This is a lot of code. This is only 20 lines of code, and look at everything it's doing in that code. That is a lot. We hit on for loops. We hit on nested for loops. We hit on objects. We hit on nested arrays or multi-dimensional arrays. We hit on events. We hit on the DOM and get element by ID. We took an entire interface that we built from scratch tonight and layered that all into our JavaScript. We just built a dynamic interface based off a complex data structure, including multi-dimensional arrays. Remember when we were back, like, playing with grids and we thought that was cool? Turning up the heat a little bit, right? Remember, your homework for this weekend, which is not in Canvas yet, is going to be going through this code and leaving comments to show that you understand how this code works. We do not expect you to be able to write this code. We do expect you to be able to understand this code. And so if you want to break that homework assignment up every night after class, go through and leave your comments in here. That's going to make it a lot easier to understand as we build up to that code. We've got a lot more work to do on this tomorrow, and we may go a little faster, not much faster, but a little bit faster because we're going to take Wednesday and Thursday off. But we've got some work to do here. Our movie is not showing up the price. We've got some issues where we need to be able to click on the data and be able to make those chairs change. We need to make this code a little bit more reusable so that when the seat is clicked on, we're able to do the right thing. So we've got functions coming down the pipeline. We've got DRY, don't repeat yourself, drying out our code coming your way. We've got to update the information based off of what is selected. That's an on-click event coming your way. But this is the worst of it. This is the most complex part of it. This is bridging the gap between our JavaScript data and our HTML that gets shown to the user. This is what you want to anchor in on. If you can just come into class 10 minutes earlier than usual and talk yourself through this code, that's what's going to set you up for success. If there is a part of this where you get to 90% of this code and you're like, I don't get what OnChange is doing, that makes no sense to me. Go back to Free Code Camp, look at your JavaScript events, understand what that's doing in the DOM. If you're like, whoa, there's a for loop in a for loop, I don't get what that's doing. Go back up and break down, why do we need a for loop in a for loop? Well, we need to loop over each one of the rows. That's my outer for loop. And then we need to loop over each one of the seats. Break this code down. This is really complex, but this has a lot of your JavaScript concepts in this. In fact, I would give this test to a JavaScript developer to land a job interview. Being able to work with this data and generate out a user interface based off of this data is what we're doing here. Go back, make sure you're getting your level of understanding from all of that. All of that said, and 4 minutes left, were there any terms that we want to capture in tonight's outline? Don't all
I don't
go
know if
at
this
once.
was previously defined, but the ninth child, that was kind of new to me.
It's a good sign that we don't have new terms here, right? Because what we're realizing is all of those concepts that you're learning are all being used in here. Any other terms that we want to capture for the evening?
Generated HTML.
Generated HTML. We're going to say an empty string we created to hold the HTML as we loop over a JS object or array to convert the JS data structure into a user interface that is viewable in HTML. So in other words, what we're saying there is this generated HTML, we could call that anything. We could call that HTML to show if we wanted to. And as long as we use that consistently in all the places we added to the generated HTML, we can use that down here. At the end of the day, this is just a string. It's a string that's holding all of this HTML. And once we take that string and pass it back into the inner HTML, the browser takes that string, recognizes all the HTML inside of it, and makes it show up for the end user. Another one, inline block display. And I'm going to very loosely say allows us to use width and height properties on a div while positioning itself based off inline properties like text align center. Other display CSS values include flex, block, inline, etc. Anything else? Any terms or concepts that we touched on tonight that we want to capture in these notes? All right, I can hear your brain sizzling from here. Got one more night of me until you get a full 2 days off for a break and then the whole weekend as well. So say goodnight to you now. I will see you guys tomorrow night where we go for movie theater seats part 2. See y'all.